Okay, so I have been reading this book about vinyl records, and there's this one little part today that just stuck in my head. There's a part where someone is talking. The book's mostly interviews. Actually, not mostly. It is all interviews with people involved in the record industry, in particular around the vinyl record industry, making vinyl, being recording artists, owning record labels, things like that. So somebody in there was talking about, I believe it was the guy that was a photographer for the Rolling Stones in the early days. He talked about the moment in the 70s when artists and everybody else, the record industry in general, realized that musical artists were a commercial product. I'm not sure exactly what he meant by that, but it just kind of stuck in my head. And then later, someone, maybe the same person, was talking about MTV and how when MTV came out, it predefined what people thought of the music. Actually, I think it was one of the co-founders of Record Store Day who was talking about this. When you heard a song, I think he used the example of Wooden Ships by Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. When you heard that on a record, what you saw in your head was different than what somebody else did. I mean, you had the record cover to look at, but that wasn't specific to the song. That was just kind of giving you a vibe of the band. Whereas once MTV came out, if you saw the video for Hot for Teacher from Van Halen and somebody else saw the video for Hot for Teacher from Van Halen, you both had the same imagery in your head. And that word commercial comes up here again. In specific, he calls MTV music videos commercials for songs. And I'd never thought about it like that. Maybe because I was about under 10 years old when MTV came out. I don't remember the exact year MTV came out. So I never went through that process of trying to figure out what this thing was. It was just something that, for me, just existed. And in that way, being such a young person, it was something that, in a way, operated like something that always existed. So I never really thought about it, but it's true that music videos were commercials for songs, not even for albums, for songs. And this whole conversation connects back to earlier in that book. There's an interview with Henry Rollins, and Henry Rollins is talking about the importance of vinyl. Obviously, that's one of the key points of this book, if not the key point of the book. But he says that some music does not ever escape its commercial aspirations, and that some music doesn't even intend to. And I thought about that at the time as being pretty profound, but now as I'm connecting to this, I started to understand that there's another part to what Rollins says there. He says that this music, like, I think he's mainly talking about like pop mainstream music, that it is not music really fully, but it's an advertisement for what music could be. And I thought that was really interesting, how this idea of commercialization affected the art. And it reminds me of the Neil Postman book, Amusing Ourselves to Death. And in that book, Neil Postman writes about television. I believe the book was written in the 80s, maybe the 90s. He talks about how the medium of television, the way television functions, actually changed the way human beings think. That we think in TV logic. Now, I can't go into the whole explanation of that. The whole reason I'm bringing these up is not to like go into depth on those ideas, but all of this connects to the idea of how something, the shape of something, affects what it is. Let me put this into creativity terms, which is where I'm going with this. Seeing is in the doing. You don't understand what you're doing. You don't understand what it is until it's tangible, until it's something that you've worked with. Example of this, to leave it out, take it out of the abstract so we can connect back to that. With writing, the advice I always give people on writing, probably the number one thing I always tell people is put it on paper. Whatever it is, put it on paper. Put it on paper. Get it out of here. It's not because you're afraid you're going to lose it, which, I mean, that's a good reason to write it down too. But by putting it on paper, you give it a shape. It becomes part of the tangible world. Now, I understand that words on paper aren't literally tangible, but it takes a shape. It takes a shape in the sentences and the words and the things that you put down there. And the reason that that's important is because if you have a book idea or a story idea and you leave it up here, it's continually shifting. It's continually changing. It's like, you know, these things that people make that they end up taking pictures of, where they put oil in water and then they put some watercolor in the oil, and you just have these shapes that are just kind of moving around and separating, and like a lava lamp. That's what is up here with a story or a book idea. And it stays up there and it keeps shifting and shaping. And the shape that it's always going to take in your head is the best possible form. It's always going to be perfect in your head. But when you put it on paper, this is the hardest part about writing, in my opinion, is getting over the disappointment. The realization that what ends up down here on the desk isn't going to look as good as what's up here. And there's a reason for that. It's not because what happens down on the page can never live up to what's in the brain. It's that the thing on the page can never be what's in the brain because the thing in the brain doesn't have a shape. It has a quality, and the quality is perfection. But it doesn't have a shape. When things are down here in words and letters, then they have a shape. And the reason it's important to get it down there is two things. You have to get over that fear of it not being good, because you put it down, it's going to not be good. Hemingway once said, the first draft of everything is shit. And I believe that's true. But it's an important step because it's what makes it real. You bring it down and that's what makes it real. So just like how looking at artists as commercial products changed music, and how MTV making music commercials changed how people interacted with the songs. You know, if that wooden ships idea, two people have different visions in their head. When they talk, they're exchanging visions. Oh, I saw this. Oh, I saw this. But if you both saw Hot for Teacher, all you can talk about is the hot teacher and maybe the drum part at the beginning. There's a change in that dialogue. And we have to get things onto the page. And this obviously applies beyond just writing, but I'm going to stick with writing now. We'll go a little bit outside of that afterwards. But you have to get it on the page so that you can get over that fear. Actually, I shouldn't say get over it, so you can start dealing with it. It may never go away, but you can start dealing with it. The hardest part is the anticipation of feeling it. That's, I think, what keeps most people from sitting at the desk. Woody Allen has said this, and I think it comes from somebody else, but the hardest part about writing isn't the writing, it's putting your ass in the chair. And I think what prevents so many writers and so many creative people from putting their ass in the proverbial chair is that impending disappointment. What if this isn't good? What if this isn't good enough? This is something Linda Berry talks about in her book, What It Is. Or is it What Is It? I think it's What It Is. I'm dyslexic, so those two words in my head, I can't remember if it's what it is or what is it. But she talks about the idea of good. You know, at what age did we decide that things had to be good? When you look at kids' drawings, they're not drawing from a place of, is this good? They're just drawing from a place of, this is it. This is what I'm doing. So when you get it down on the page, you can begin to deal with, oh, this is what it looks like. And then you can, this is the second part about it. Once it's on there and it is imperfect and it is shit like Hemingway says, then you can start to work with it. You can start to move it around. You can start to change it, understand it. That's really one of the most important parts about getting something down on paper. You think you know what it is up here, but you don't. Seeing is in the doing. You don't know what it is until you start doing it. Nobody that I can think of writes exactly what they saw in their head. They start writing, it changes. They learn more about the character. The character doesn't want to do that thing that you originally intended, so you do this. Something writers talk about a lot, and people who don't write fiction maybe don't understand when people say that the characters come alive, but they do. In not obviously not a literal sense, but you're investing so much into, if you're doing your job, you're investing so much into who this person is that you start to understand how they would react to things. So while you may want them to take the bus, this character, with everything that you've fed into them, is going, no, I would not take the bus. Think about all the things you know about me. Would I take the bus? No, I would not take the bus. That's what they mean when they say a character comes alive. And that only happens because of what's on the page, of what the tangible thing in front of you is. In the doing of the act of writing, that you begin to understand what you're writing. Now let's pull that outside of just writing. Let me give you another example. In the tech world, I come originally from, before Texas, I came from Silicon Valley, California, surrounded by tech. Everybody's talking about it, it seemed like. And you because of that, you start to learn some of the stories. Maybe you're interested now because you're immersed in it. So you read some books on it. You YouTube. You see videos on it. You just learn these things about these companies. One of the things that was a big deal, I don't know if they still talk about this now, but was the idea of the pivot. The pivot. The pivot was a big deal because when you're making a business, you think you're making this. It's the stuff that's up here. And then you start making the business and you start seeing where you're getting customers and what's going on. And then you realize, oh, it's not this, it's this. This is where the business is, over here. So pivot. If you fail to pivot, then you're theoretically, the idea is that your business will fail. So you pivot to where the business is. An example of this. Instagram was not originally a photo sharing app. Most people don't know this story. It was originally called Bourbon. I think it was Bourbn. It was, this is like Tumblr days where they were leaving letters out of names and stuff like that. And it was a check-in thing. I don't know if anybody even remembers Foursquare, but it was like this idea: you go to places and you check in. Most people do this with Facebook, if they do it at all. But you check in, telling people, hey, I'm getting frozen yogurt a block from my house. And the idea behind the whole thing was, if your other friends were on the app and they saw that you were at the yogurt place and they were at the drugstore next door, that, hey, I'm right there, let me come over and say hi. In that way, it was a cool idea because it was about using the digital to support actual interaction instead of replace it, which is what Instagram ended up doing. But that was the original point of the app. It was a check-in type thing. And one of the features was a place where you could share photos of being at the places. And Systrom, the founder of Instagram, noticed that people weren't using anything in the app except the photo sharing part. So that's when he pivoted. What if we just make this mostly about photos? And then, if they want to add their location to where their photo is, they can do that. That became like the main point of the app, became like the addendum, and then the side feature, the photos, became the main thing, the pivot. But they only understood that by making the first version of the app, using it, seeing how people use it, and realizing that it wasn't what they thought it was. It wasn't the blob, the perfect blob up here. It was this imperfect thing on paper that they could edit and they could polish and they could rewrite. Another example, what you're listening to or seeing right now. When I first started doing audios, is that a term? When I first started recording these verbally, it was originally for Read or Die Slave. Many of you who are going to hear this right now are hearing it via Read or Die Slave, which is my Substack. And it was a way for me to... It was a way for me... This is very recently. This is a couple weeks ago we're talking about. I'm not going back in time here very far. It was a way for me to take the idea of the daily reading notes that I was doing and make it more approachable to me and maybe more approachable to other people. I just feel like the format, once again, the shape of things determine what they are. The format makes it different. The medium makes it different. To go back to Neil Postman's teacher, Marshall McLuhan, the medium is the message. The medium with which you present something takes the message takes the shape of that medium. And I originally did that as a way to try to deal with that. It was also because there was so much friction in the process of writing stuff in my journal and then coming in here and typing it and editing it. It was taking so much time that it wasn't good for my main projects, writing and editing working towards books. That's my number one goal, and anything that gets in the way of that has to be pushed aside. And that was getting in the way of it. So in doing that was a jump. I had this idea, jump, do it. Okay. I get in there and I realize I start to see the shape of it. Oh, maybe I can just do this as audio. And then as I started doing that as audio, I realized I should be doing this daily. What if I do daily audio? I think I only did like 3 days in a row before I realized something's wrong here. Now that I can see this, now that the seeing is in the doing, now that I'm doing this, now that I can see it, I actually see what I'm doing. I guess a way to say it is sometimes creativity starts with an impulse. And because it's an impulse, you don't really know what you're doing. But then when you start actually doing the steps, the erasing and the writing and the rewriting and the sculpting, that's when you actually start to actually see what you're doing. Oh, I'm writing a book about grief. You didn't know that when you started. You just had this story. And you start to write it and you go, oh, that's okay. That's what this is about. That's what this character is feeling. So for me, this usually starts often with friction. There's something wrong. This is both in writing and this, which I guess you could say podcasting. It starts with the friction. There's something, it's not a positive friction, like there's a positive friction that compels you to go forward. It's a challenge. This is the kind of friction that makes you stop or feel like you're going to stop or you're going to burn out. I started to feel that. And so I have a whiteboard behind me and I just put on the whiteboard, what am I doing? Just question myself, what am I doing? And I realized, looking at like the description of what I had written for what I was doing, was an amorphous blob. It was something that comes straight out of my head onto the paper. And I'm like, if I was somebody who didn't know what this was and I read this, what would I make of it? And the answer I came to was not much. So I thought maybe, I'm going to talk about books, because it's called Read or Die or Slave. So the book part is going to be part of it. But I also want to talk about analog because, that's something I'm doing over on my YouTube. And I figure maybe that will show up over here in the book and the analog thing are connected. And then I started doing it and I started talking a lot about stuff like this, about creativity and the creative process and the struggles of creativity and the insights that come with creativity. So it's kind of about books and creativity and analog, and that all makes sense together because in my mind, they're all connected. But to everybody else, it's this blob. So in my question to myself, what am I doing? I started writing it out. And as I was writing it out, I realized I was making columns. So I have this, EDC thing over here. I have this thing about analog over here. I have this thing about creativity over here. I have this thing about books over here. Holy crap. This isn't one thing. I'm doing multiple things. And I didn't understand that because until I started doing it, I couldn't see it. I didn't know what it was. I didn't understand it. And when you start to see things, you start to, like I said, understand them, but you start to have a better understanding of the functioning and the purpose of them. And that's a really big thing with creativity. It's not just about the impulse to create. It's not just about the desire to create. It's not just about the idea. A lot of people get stuck on having good ideas. The purpose is a really important part. And that purpose isn't really defined until you start doing, because you think you have a purpose. You think you're writing a science fiction book about expanding into space. But in the doing, you would discover you're actually writing a science fiction book that is a metaphor against autocracies. But you didn't know that. So the mechanisms of the process start to inform you, and you start to, once you understand, I'm writing a book about autocracies, then you can start looking up and learning things about autocracies, and then you can start to focus and shape things with purpose. Having that purpose allows you to shape it to fit the purpose. So the scene is in the doing. So I could look at those 4 things on the board and go, okay, EDC, what am I doing with this? What do I want from it? And what is the best form that it takes? Now for me, that project is about showing things that I think, products that I use that I think are good, mostly everyday carry products, but not specifically limited to that. But I don't want to make product videos and sell things. I don't want to do flashy edits. I just want to talk about them. And I want to talk about the reasons why they work and the reasons why I think they have value. And recently I've realized that part of that as well is I want to focus on American products because I'm really interested in saving small towns and bringing manufacturing back to America. So all of a sudden I have this focus. I knew I was doing EDC stuff, but I have this focus like, okay, so this isn't really just videos. These are actually video podcasts. It's actually about me talking, but people being able to see the objects while I'm talking about them. So I could change the name of the channel to Curly's Curated Video Podcast. So people come to it and understand the shape of it. I'm communicating the shape because now I understand it. I've seen what it is. And then that changes the way that I interact with the content I make. It's no longer about what's the next product. It's what's the next concept. I could take the same product and talk about it 5 different ways because that's the type of thing that is. And so then I could say, is video the best format for this? Because I'm saying video podcast. Would it work as a podcast? No, it doesn't. Because most of the time, what I'm talking about, people need to be able to see. So it works as a video podcast. Now I understand that. I see it. Then I go down the line to the next thing. I go down to my analog channel, where I talk about a lot about my note-taking process, my Zettelkasten, which is analog on index cards. That's how that channel started, was just originally sharing that. And then over time, as I started doing that, I realized that channel, I also wanted to talk more about analog in general. What other ways am I bringing analog back into my life? What does that mean? So as I started doing that, I started understanding the shape of that. And I thought about that. I'm like, could that work as a podcast? No, because I think that's visual too. If I'm going to show how I'm using a calendar, I can't do that verbally, so I have to show it. So I know those 2 things, but now I have these other 2 things, which now I'm starting to separate, right? Read or Die a Slave. And then I have this description of the show, Dispatches from Creative Isolation. Those don't match up. And I realize that Read or Die a Slave is about books. It's about sharing my love of reading, sharing the books that I'm finishing reading, my thoughts on them. And this thing about creativity, this Dispatches from Creative Isolation, that's something different. That's this. That's what you're hearing or seeing right now. Dispatches from Creative Isolation. That's the name. That's not the description. That's the name. And that it is about this, just talking through the creative process. Where am I right now with the creative process? What am I learning? What am I struggling with? And that's different, and it deserves to be different. It lives on the Substack in a different section. There's no reason to create separate things for that. But I could ask myself this question now. What form do both of these need? What form serves them both? Well, audio, I think, is a big part of it, because it's about talking about these things. It's about talking about the books, and then in the other one, it's about talking about creativity. So talking, podcast, that works. But also there's sometimes when I might want to write something. So it makes sense for them both to be on Substack, because sometimes I might write something and put it out. But then I started to ask myself a question too. What about if it's also video? Does it need to just be audio? Is there any reason that it's only just audio? And the answer to that was no. So now all of a sudden I had this thing that was one thing. It was a Substack. Now I have 2 things. They're both podcasts, but they're also both newsletters. And they're also both available now on YouTube. Because these messages, these things that I'm talking about, these things I'm sharing, don't need to just be for an audio audience. They can be for a video audience. But the only way I learned these things was through doing and pivoting. So my advice today, as I'm being reminded of this in so many ways, is take it out of your head and get it down on paper. And I will say, put it on paper over put it on the computer. Obviously, if you're coding and stuff, that's different. But if you can put it on paper, put it on paper. Just because I think it counteracts the disappointment. Going back to what I said earlier, this is perfect. What you put down here is going to be imperfect. And that's okay. That's what it's supposed to be. But there is a disappointment there. Some people quit after that. Like the hardest part is to get it down. And then some people quit after that. Look at podcasts. How many podcasts, how many YouTube channels make 1, 2, maybe 4 episodes? I remember reading at one point that I think like 60%, at one point 60% of the podcasts in the Apple Podcast directory had less than 3 episodes. So some people quit there. So putting it on paper has a weird psychological effect in the sense that, yes, this is imperfect. And maybe you write it with pencil and you write it in sloppy handwriting. And then it's imperfect in every way. But there is something satisfying about the tangible reality you're confronted with when you get something out of your head and you have it down here. So while you're experiencing disappointment, you're also experiencing this sense of, I manifested this. I brought this thing that didn't exist in reality into reality. In its imperfect, ugly, crappy state that it is in, incomplete, full of holes, trite, whatever you want to add to it. But it exists here. And before I did that, it did not. And I think that has a powerful psychological effect that helps to counteract that disappointment. That you can have an idea for a drawing and never draw it. It'll always be a perfect drawing in your head, but you get no satisfaction from having that perfect drawing in your head. And when you draw something on paper and it sucks, it's a bummer because it sucks, but it still feels better than never having drawn it. It's that to love and loss is better to have never loved at all, because the experience itself, the value is in the experience. The scene is in the doing. So, my advice, put it on paper now.